Science.
Engineering.
Medicine.
Chemistry.
Physics.
Biology. Humanities. Cardiology.
Computer. Public health. Global
Aeronautics. Science communication.
Hello everyone, I'm Gareth Mitchell. Today we choose the moon in a space-themed special edition to mark 50 years since Apollo 11. We're hearing from UK space explorer Helen Sharman about her experiences of being in orbit and what she thinks is the next frontier. And we hear from a doctor who's addressing some of the big questions about sustaining humans on future Mars missions that will be years long.
There are many questions that remain unanswered. How do you make sure that these people are going to function living in very extreme conditions of stress and isolation? Is it appropriate to use all the consumables that you have to try to save that person, knowing that you will impair the likelihood of survival of the rest of the crew for the rest of the mission?
And what about the neurological challenges of future space missions? It's all right here in this special edition. All right, let's jump in, and you're probably expecting me to say we're going to jump in with some news, but not this time, dear people, not when we have had the 50th anniversary of the moon landings to celebrate over the last week or so. So we have not just the usual two people here to start the podcast, but four whole people. Yes, we have Kieran, Caroline, Rosie and Hayley. Hello, folks.
Hello.
And in fine voice they are too, because Hayley, you had a cunning plan for this, didn't you, Hayley Dunning, for this intro?
Yes, I thought instead of news we would find some lesser known facts about the Apollo 11 moon landing. So I've got one for you, Gareth. Did you know that the first feet on the moon were Canadian?
I did not know that.
So it's not Neil Armstrong, he was very American, but the feet of the lunar lander, the legs and the little pads, were actually built in Quebec by a Canadian company. But wrapped in a foil made in good old America, so...
That's a good fact. Can I have one before we go on to our next fact person?
Go for it.
Okay, this is one thing that I learned listening to the BBC's excellent 13 Minutes to the Moon podcast that I've been following absolutely avidly. In this one I learned that when the command module and the LEM separated, so then the LEM could go down with its Canadian feet, as I've now learnt, onto the lunar surface. What they didn't realise, the little tunnel linking these two modules just had a tiny little bit of extra pressure in it. So when the two separated, the LEM came away just slightly faster than it might have done. And that slight error that hadn't been accounted for in all the calculations and the planetary physics to work out its landing point on the moon, that little error was the reason why the LEM just came in slightly long when Neil Armstrong's trying to bring it down, and it just slightly overshot the intended landing spot. And it was because this little bit of trapped gas. I love that detail. That's so geeky. Right, now, Caroline Brogan, what have you got for us?
We Earthlings are subject to security checks and customs and declaration forms when we travel abroad. But what about when you've holidayed on the moon and decide to join us back on Earth? Well, when the Apollo 11 crew came back to Earth, they were asked to sign customs and declarations forms. In the section asking for where did you depart from, they had to put the moon.
Did they have to go through the red channel then?
They had nothing to declare, I don't think.
It's a thought, isn't it? Also, a giant leap for this podcast. We have a new person we've not heard from before, Rosie Hassani. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
What is your Apollo fact?
So I have another fact. Basically, we all know the first words of Neil Armstrong as he stepped foot onto the moon. That's one small step for man and one giant leap for mankind. However, his first step onto the moon wasn't small at all. In fact, he had landed the lunar module so gently that the shock absorbers hadn't compressed. So his first step out onto the moon was actually close to a 4-foot jump onto the lunar surface.
That's an amazing fact. So luckily with such small gravity, he didn't do his back in.
Wow, exactly. That's what I was thinking.
That far onto the surface. So yeah, a more giant leap than anybody had planned for. Right, let's get Kieran Brophy on mic here. What have you got for us?
So Gareth, did you know that the lives of the men on Apollo 11 were arguably saved by the humble pen?
I had no idea.
Well, so Armstrong and Aldrin, they'd already landed on the moon and had been collecting rock and dust samples for almost 3 hours. And as they were climbing back into the lunar module in preparation to return home, Armstrong smashed into the switch that activated the ascent engine that would lift them off from the moon. Luckily enough, Aldrin came to the rescue with a pen, which was all they had left because they jettisoned all the remaining tools that they had to save weight. And he was able to engage a circuit breaker that would trigger their ascent. And that humble felt-tipped pen is now on display in the Museum of Flight in Seattle, Washington. My also favourite factoid is Buzz Aldrin's mom's maiden name was Moon.
Oh, that was meant to be nominative determinism there, if ever there was such a thing. Yes. What amazing facts they all were. I've just got another moon fact to end this little section with, but it doesn't involve Apollo 11, because on Monday, as we sit here recording this podcast intro, just in the last couple of hours, India has launched a mission to the moon. So this is the Indian Space Research Organisation, and it's just launched the Chandrayaan-2 spacecraft. And Prime Minister Narendra Modi, as I sit here now, has just tweeted, efforts such as Chandrayaan-2 will further encourage our bright youngsters towards science, top quality research and innovation. Thanks to Chandrayaan, India's lunar programme will get a substantial boost. Our existing knowledge of the moon will be significantly enhanced. The words there of the Indian Prime Minister ending this lovely section we've just had about the moon. But, Hayley Dunning, whilst we have you in the studio, let's continue to talk space. What do you have?
Well, yes, who better to talk about space at a time like this than Helen Sharman, who was, of course, the first British astronaut. She visited the Mir space station in 1991, which actually makes her a cosmonaut, technically. And I chatted to her about, the future of spaceflight, so human versus robotic and all sorts of things like that. But first, whether she remembers the Apollo 11 mission.
I was 6 when Armstrong took those first steps on the moon. And I remember the significance of it in that my father obviously didn't think I was really appreciating this. And so he dragged me down to the bottom of the garden and he pointed up at the moon and he said, "Don't you understand? There are people now walking on the moon." And for me, the significance and the emphasis of that word walking that I heard so much was relevant because my sister had recently learnt how to walk. And I thought, well, if she can walk and I can walk, what's the big deal about walking? And so it was still lost on me until, of course, later on when I started to appreciate what they'd gone through, the technology, how brave they were really doing stuff that was quite pioneering and first steps that could have gone so wrong and yet they went so right.
It's seen as a pinnacle of human exploration of space, but a lot of what we've done since has been robotic. Do you think there's still a place for human exploration?
I think when we try and think about robotics and humans, I think we're really much better off thinking about humans using robots and space being explored by both. It's a bit like saying, is it better to buy a pint of milk or a full lunch? Different things have different value. Robots are better than humans at some things, so they're more reliable, and their sensory acuity, their precision is better, and they're expendable, of course. Whereas humans are actually much better than robots at mobility. So if we compare what the Mars Exploration Rover Opportunity was able to do, I think, in something like in a day, humans, because of that, they can think in real time and so on, they can do in a minute. What the Apollo 17 crew, where they covered the actual physical distance that they covered, took 8 years for a rover to actually cover that distance. So it's completely different. And I think it's when you think about the value that you get from robotic missions and the value you get from human missions, it's just different. And you have to look at the value for money when you're thinking about the cost, because of course that everything does boil down to the cost in the end, and we have to make choices and prioritise. But I think overall the value for money is probably slightly better on the human side of things. Ian Crawford at Birkbeck has calculated, he reckons humans are 2 to 3 orders of magnitude more efficient, yet they're 1 to 2 orders of magnitude more expensive.
Now, at the time of the moon landing, the only way you could really get to the moon was with governments, NASA and now ESA and Roscosmos. But now there are commercial flights, there are SpaceX and Mars One and companies like that. Do you see those as a good thing in helping us reach these goals?
Commercial spaceflight generally, I think, is just fabulous. It's going to reduce the cost of space. It's going to increase access to space for all sorts of purposes. And we've been talking about tourism for a long time, I know. But scientists will have improved access because the cost will just come down and the availability generally will go right up. So I think it's generally a good thing. We do have to be a bit careful. Law, legislation, all this sort of stuff needs to be developed so that we've got the right health and safety put in, and so that we're not doing things. For instance, Mars One, I thought, was actually quite unethical. the idea that we might send people on a one-way mission. So I think we have to be careful on what we're doing, and we can't just go off and let people do whatever they like. And we also have to be careful about the pollution out there. So pollution in orbit, so debris kind of things, but also what we do. Are we going to be polluting parts of space? We don't know what life forms might be out there, so we have to be careful. And there's also the consideration of mining asteroids, bringing back the materials. So yes, great in principle, but again, we have to be careful not to mine asteroids to the point that they're so depleted that we there aren't able to use them or understand them, and they're not part of the solar system in the future.
Now, this is obviously the 50th anniversary of the moon landing, and at that time I imagine there was a lot of excitement about where we'd be in 50 years' time. Why do you think it petered out after this initial excitement?
Initially it was very much an American propaganda thing, wasn't it? So finally the Americans were able to say that they had beaten the Soviets at something. The Americans will still say that they won the space race. I think people who are perhaps a little bit more global in their outlook might say that the Americans won some things and the Soviets won others. But so there was no longer that political imperative. We found out a lot about the moon by sending people there. We found out that we could do things as well, and we can use those in other parts of space exploration. And we could have carried on going back, but it was very expensive. And what you can actually get out of other parts of space exploration, we've chosen to spend our money in other ways. And in my view, actually, I think that was right. However, the next step of going to Mars will require going back to the moon. So I think, yes, to go back to the moon just for its own sake, no big deal. And a lot of the Apollo astronauts would say, we should have been aiming to go to Mars a long time ago. And perhaps that is also true, not just to go back to the moon, but where else can we send humans to? And now's the right time, but we have to do it collaboratively. And this will be a wonderful way of making sure that internationally we try and stop one individual nation planting a flag and claiming whatever corner of space it is just for that particular nation state.
Would you go to Mars?
I'd love to go back into space. So that was the first, easy to answer. Yes, I'd love to go back into space, but to go to Mars, yes. Even a few months there, a few months back, a few months on the surface. Time of life now, I'm in my 50s. Yeah, time's right. I'll go to Mars. Would you go?
Definitely. I've not been to space and it's probably scarier than I imagined, but I'll be up for it.
Oh, can I come too? Hayley Dunning there with Helen Sharman. So, Earth orbit is one thing, lunar missions are another, so where next? Deeper into the solar system, and off we go to our neighbour Mars. But keeping crews physically and mentally healthy on missions that will last not for weeks, but years, is going to test modern medicine to its limits and beyond. Imperial's Ryan O'Hare has been finding out more at Charing Cross Hospital from Dr. Mathieu Komorowski, who's an intensive care medic and a researcher who's worked with both NASA and the European Space Agency.
Space is not a place where humans should be, really. It's a very harsh environment. When you leave the Earth's atmosphere, you're exposed to basically nothing at all, the vacuum of space. So very extreme changes in temperature depending on whether you're facing the sun or not. So on the ISS, temperatures vary from minus 120 to plus 150 degrees. There's lots of other risks, including the risk of radiation. We're protected on the surface of the Earth by the Earth magnetosphere. Going to Mars, you could be exposed to 300 times higher than what you would get for the same period if you were to stay on Earth. So talking about flying to Mars for 900 days, you would significantly increase your risk of cancer and other health effects, including cardiovascular aging, cataract, and so on. Another risk that I should mention right outside the Earth's atmosphere is the risk of being hit by the junk that is orbiting Earth. Most of them are just debris from satellites, and these pieces of metal travel at sometimes several kilometers per second. There's no way you can be protected, so they would just kill you, for example, if you were doing a spacewalk.
So do we know what sort of impact the original moon landing had on the health of the crew?
Actually, we know very little. The main purpose of the moon landing was a technological demonstration of a capability of a country to do so, much more than collecting any data around the health effects of being exposed to partial gravity. We're sort of making some progress now using parabolic flights.
And these are the planes people will be aware of seeing people float about in zero G for a few seconds at a time?
Yeah, absolutely. What's interesting is that if you fly the plane slightly differently, you can achieve partial levels of gravity. So there are programs looking at biomedical research in partial gravity, which is an exciting area of research.
But in terms of the medics that are carrying out sort of medicine in space, what sort of challenges do they face in these kind of environments?
Well, being a doctor in space is not an easy task, because basically you're on your own if anything happens. Especially the day we'll leave low Earth orbit. So currently on the ISS, most of the time there is a medical doctor, and they have access to pretty much real-time telemedical support to talk whenever needed to doctors on the ground.
So while we had the original moon landing 50 years ago, space agencies are starting to set their sights much further afield. So we know that the mission to Mars could take astronauts away from Earth for anywhere up to or even beyond 900 days. So in terms of health of the crew, how do you plan for a mission of this kind of length?
There are many questions that remain unanswered. Can we protect the crew appropriately? What kind of psychological profile is the most appropriate? How do you make sure that these people are going to function correctly as individuals, but also as a crew for, as you said, 900 days, living in very extreme conditions of stress and isolation? How do you deal with medical emergencies? What kind of medical kit do you put on board? What about the medical skills? What kind of doctor do you need on board? What do you do if the doctor himself becomes sick or dies? If you find yourself dealing with a patient who's extremely sick, but you only have a limited amount of supply, what should you be doing? Is it appropriate to use all the consumables that you have to try to save that person, knowing that you will impair the likelihood of survival of the rest of the crew for the rest of the mission? There was an interesting study where tablets of antibiotics were shipped to space, kept on the ISS for 900 days, and then brought back to Earth, and compared to the same drugs that were kept on Earth as control. And what was shown very, very nicely is that the potency was lower for the tablets that had been flown to space, meaning that they lose their effect quicker. So if we were to send antibiotics with astronauts on a mission to Mars, it is possible that by the time they reach Mars, the antibiotics would basically be way less effective than what they should be.
So in terms of the future of space medicine, do you think we'll ever see anything like we see on sci-fi movies and sci-fi shows like Star Trek with the tricorders and things like that?
I mean, there's two things can happen, right? Either humanity will collapse and disappear, or we'll expand into space, and if we do, eventually it will be at the large scale, meaning lots of people living in space. So it's not impossible that there will be scenes like we see in science fiction movies with large-scale colonies with lots of types of different spacecrafts going all over the solar system and even potentially beyond. If we started to look towards space a bit more and invest more in this, technically it would be feasible.
That was Dr. Mathieu Komorowski speaking there to Ryan O'Hare. Well, back here in the studio, we still have Hayley Dunning. And Hayley, you've been finding out yet more about space and working with robots, haven't you?
Yes, so astronauts already use robots and robotic parts, like robotic arms, to work in space, but they face a lot of challenges in doing that. So spacewalks, for example, can be quite difficult, and controlling these robots, like the big arms around the space station. So how do we get the interface right between robots and humans? Technology that taps into the brain and to the body's senses is helping astronauts make these interactions more harmonious. So I've been speaking to Fanny Delegiani, a research associate at the Hamlin Centre, about her research and her background.
I studied engineering and I was fascinated by images and photography. So I went to image processing and then medical imaging. Subsequently, I really like to understand better how the brain works, and I got an MRC fellowship to investigate brain connectivity between different brain regions, both with functional and structural MRI data. And this also led towards an MSc neuroscience at UCL. All these disciplines, like computing, neuroscience, psychology, and so on, they all try from a different perspectives to understand how the brain works.
You've been involved in many interesting projects, and among them, the one I really want to talk about today in our moon landing special is your work with Fair Space. So can you tell me a little more about what Fair Space is?
So Fair Space is an industrially driven EPSRC project. It stands for Future Artificial Intelligence and Robotics in Space Applications. It is led by the University of Surrey, it's our hub leader. Imperial in particular works in human-robot interaction in space. We are interested in designing wearable technology, both for the helmet as well as the astronaut spacesuit.
Now, when we're talking about robots and astronauts working together, we're not talking about astronauts controlling R2-D2 or something like that. What are these kind of robots?
We're looking into how to augment the abilities of the astronauts with robots. This can be a robotic arm. It can be also a teleoperated rover, which is on a planet like Moon or Mars and teleoperated by a human in orbit.
How does your research influence the design of spacesuits and helmets?
So I work on neuroergonomics. It's a discipline that tries to monitor brain signals in order to improve decision-making, cognitive performance, attention, situation awareness in human-robot interaction. And all these technologies come together to understand how we can improve the space helmet in astronauts in order to avoid fatigue, to avoid accidents due to lack of attention, and so on. This area also influenced the design of sensing in the inner suit, which comes to detect acute stress, for example. And my colleagues work on designing those sensors and monitor galvanic sense response, heart rate, and so on.
I know you've also been working with astronauts' gloves, so what are some of the challenges there?
Astronauts, they have to work for very long hours when they go for a spacewalk. For example, they can take 6 or 10 hours or so in extreme environments where temperature varies significantly. And especially for the hands, this is very difficult because the current astronaut glove, they don't have any dexterity and they're pressurized. The tools need to be large with special handles and triggers. So what we're trying to do is to develop grasping technology in order to alleviate these problems.
Better manipulation in these gloves and sensors in these helmets will, of course, help astronauts doing spacewalks complete their tasks. But what other applications of these technologies do you foresee?
We developed this technology with also the view how to be useful here in Earth. There are very specific fields like medical robotics, for example, and neuroergonomics. There is a lot of work there, and all our work translates. For grasping technology are very important in home care and to help disabled people. And our work on wearable exoskeletons and muscle atrophy in space translate also very well in helping elderly people or people with neuromuscular problems.
Now, finally, this is our moon landing special, so would you go to the moon?
Well, definitely when all this technology mature.
Be much easier.
Of course.
Yes, Fanny Deliajani speaking there to Hayley Dunning. And that brings this edition to a close. Don't forget there are lots of ways that you can find us. Go to your favourite podcatcher. That's probably what we've just done and why you're listening to this. But we are also on iTunes, we're on Spotify, YouTube. We even do visual podcasts on Entail. Check that out. And we're on SoundCloud. So basically, wherever you want us, you can find us. Well, we'll have more for you next time. But from me, Gareth Mitchell, and all of us on the team, thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.